Thomas Green here with Ethical Marketing Service. Today on the podcast, we have Dom Einhorn. Welcome, Dom.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Good meeting you.
No problem. Would you like to start by telling the audience a bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity. I was born and raised in France, spent the better part of the last quarter century in the US between 1993 and 1998, initially as a startup entrepreneur, and in more recent years as an angel investor. In March of 2018, I moved back to France to launch Uniqorn, which is an incubator accelerator for technology startups.
Okay. And for those that don't know, can you tell people what an incubator is?
Sure. As its name indicates, typically when you think of incubator without knowing what it is, you've probably seen them in hospitals when premature babies come out of the mother's womb. They're usually put into a warm and comforting place, allowing them to mature slightly before being taken home. That is exactly what we're doing with young startups. In essence, we're babysitting them through the early process of gaining ground, gaining traction. Incubation in particular, as far as we're concerned, we're taking more of a US approach to incubation versus a Western European one. What I mean by that is that we typically start working with companies that have at least a proof of concept, may have a handful of clients. On the financing side, have at least been able to convince their grandmother to trust them with their money. And that's where we jump in. On the acceleration side, we're dealing with more mature companies that have gone through the initial growing pains already and that are primarily looking for help when it comes to customer acquisition and scaling.
Well, the experience I have with incubators comes from a TV show called Silicon Valley. Have you seen it?
I've seen the first season, and then I kind of dropped out.
Is it because of the quality of the TV show, or just busy?
Well, it's Hollywood, obviously, right? So there's a lot of truth and there's a lot of exaggeration at the same time.
Okay. So if I asked you something about incubators, which is nowhere near reality, then that's the reason.
Okay.
But generally speaking, what are the common traits that you look for when investing in a business?
I think we take a very much in the early stages a common sense approach, which is being adopted by many investors, including ourselves, because in every single case, I tend to come in personally as at least a co-investor for every startup that we decide to bring on board. In most cases, I'm also the first check writer. So what I'm looking for specifically, first and foremost, is passion. Clearly, product market fit, as everybody else would. I'm looking at, being a former somewhat a military guy myself, an element of discipline, of resiliency, which you can denote very, very quickly with the right type of entrepreneurs. In other words, if you are unable to fail, don't try to venture into becoming a startup entrepreneur in the technology field, because you will fail. The idea is to fail as quickly as possible and fail as cheaply as possible. And then I'm also looking at the team. I'm not a big fan of solo founders. What I mean by that is that while they may be absolutely brilliant, sometimes their brilliancy is not necessarily a gauge for future success. And I want to see that they have actually at least gone through the thought process of surrounding themselves with like-minded people, with people that can be complementary to themselves, because ultimately, if they are successful, they will need to scale and they will have no other option but to scale. And for that, they need a team.
I just had a conversation on scaling, actually, and about the stages of scaling. So you would look for perhaps a team or someone who's thought about putting processes in place. Is that right?
Without a doubt. So, obviously early workflow is what we're looking forward as well. At least if you haven't scaled yet, if you haven't begun to scale yet, at least show us that you've gone through the mental process of analyzing what that will mean. So if you deliver us a pro forma financials, which are also a requirement, show us that they're not picked out of thin air, but that you've actually, thought them through at every level, specifically on the human level. So, if you're scaling, what we often see, for example, is you see the revenue lines scaling very, very rapidly. And then there's somewhat being a disconnect in the pro forma financials between those revenue lines and the expense lines. And that's usually a red flag.
It's interesting that you said that you were in the military. I'm not sure if you've noticed on the internet, but there's a lot of people who maybe have taken some of those principles and applied them to business, and it's becoming more mainstream, if you like. Have you used, or do you still use, some military principles in what you do day to day?
I'd say, obviously, like most people, I've read The Art of War, but that's not really what I'm referring to. I'm mostly referring to just some character traits like resiliency, like discipline, the ability to get up at 4:15 in the morning if need be, and to get to bed at 1:30 in the morning if you have to. If you intend to become an entrepreneur, don't think you're going to be working a 9-to-5 job.
Yeah. Have you seen any Jocko yet, or Jocko Willink or David Goggins? Have you seen any of those two yet?
I have not seen that one. I missed out on that one.
It's a recommendation if you're interested in that topic. But
I'll definitely make a note of it.
so, what are some of the common mistakes that business owners make when looking for investment?
That's a very, very interesting question. And it's actually one of the problems that we're looking to resolve, because there is something that would call the expectation gap, which exists both on the startup side and on the investor side. You have very often what I call startups pitching on AM and investors listening to FM, or vice versa. So it's a gap that's profound, where either party tends to expect something from the other side they're not necessarily getting. And it's a gap that we're looking to resolve as quickly as possible. So a few examples. So if I come in as an investor, because I still tend to wear both hats, but mostly the angel investor hat these days. In my earlier years, most definitely the startup entrepreneur looking for funding. And I'm missing a key piece of information as an investor. Sometimes the young startup entrepreneur may not be able to give that to me, at least not within a reasonable period of time. That becomes a red flag, and I tend to shy away, thinking that either they're too slow or that they're ultimately not going to be able to give me this key piece of information that I'm looking for. So another major mistake that I see on the startup side is the ability or the propensity of overstating, of being too optimistic in their financials. In other words, one very common mistake is they size up a market by calculating the total market value, and then arbitrarily out of thin air picking up a number saying that within the next 5 years we intend to grab a 5% market share. And that number, again, picked out of thin air, doesn't correlate to anything that I'm seeing in the business model. There is no early traction that seems to be indicative of them being able to successfully reach a 1% market share, let alone 5. So they tend to overstate, tend to be overconfident. Now, obviously, you have to be a salesperson, to a certain degree. But at the same time, if you make such a bold statement, you better be sure that you will need to justify it in front of an astute investor. Otherwise, he will send you packing and send you out the door.
Yeah, almost like naivety, right?
Yeah, it's naive. It's overconfidence, and overconfidence in this space doesn't go too far. As an investor today, if one of the first character traits I'm looking for is authenticity, humility, authenticity. They usually go hand in hand. A humble person tends to be an awful lot more authentic than a person who is too cocky, for lack of a better term. And when I see that cockiness, I tend to just move on and say it's probably not a good fit.
I know there is some advantages to being there early as an investor if it's in the tech space, but it's, I would say, counterintuitive if you're also looking for someone who's maybe got some experience or got some years behind them. How do you weigh that up as an investor?
Yeah, so I am more of a very early stage investor personally. That certainly doesn't fit everyone, which I completely understand. So we typically are only coming in at the seed level or right around the seed level. We very rarely participate in a Series A, let alone a Series B. That's too mature for us. While a lot of funds, both retail and institutional investors, act the other way, they don't touch anything at the seed level because for them it's too risky. In our scenario, the reason why we have a stronger appetite for risk is because we typically intend to fill in the many gaps at the early stage level that a startup usually has to deal with, be it accounting, be it legal, be it on the marketing side, on the sales side. If we identify a strong founding team, strong product market fit, and there is one or the other missing, even if there's no revenue or just very early iteration of revenue traction, that is our sweet spot. But it is our sweet spot as a result of the business model that we have developed, which systematically intends to come in at that early stage and lend a helping hand to the young entrepreneur.
And you can add a lot of value with your team, is that right?
That's correct. The idea is that, in my opinion, a strong team consists of generalists, of specialists, not generalists. As a team builder, I need to build a puzzle. Assuming that puzzle has 100 pieces, the last piece I need is another me, especially if I have a gaping hole somewhere else. It's also a mistake that we see very often on both sides. So for example, we see very often a founding team of 3 PhDs in engineering, very heavy in IQ, sometimes lower on the scale in EQ. And one of the first recommendations I make to those guys is like, look, you got to surround yourself with some complementary skill sets other than yours. And vice versa, I see a lot of what I call rah-rah teams, marketing and sales guys that are light on the engineering side or on the product side, and they need to do the opposite.
Okay. And I know your business model, or at least part of your business model, is relocating businesses to France. Presumably that's on hold during COVID, but what percentage of businesses relocate to France who you've invested in, for example?
It certainly is a minority, and that is due to a number of factors. As you probably know, France is extremely good at communicating very badly. So there are a number of very, very strong incentives in place in France since Macron became president. The Macron administration, for example, was at the forefront of really promoting the French tech label, which provides very strong incentives to both domestic and international startups and investors for relocation within a French tech region. We are one of them. We are in the Dordogne department in the southwest of France, a small town called Sala, medieval town of 9,000 souls in the winter and 3 million in the summer. A very strong tourist attraction, the 7th most visited town in France. And we see that as a plus because pre-COVID, you mentioned COVID. In fact, COVID has accelerated the transitional pace that we had seen very early on, starting in early 2018. Myself, I relocated out of pure, I would say almost need, because I spent 25 years in Los Angeles, sometimes commuting 6 hours a day, dealing with smog, dealing with noise, dealing with all of the encumbrances of a large city. And one would think that in the age of a mature internet, you should be able to do your job and work properly pretty much out of everywhere. Even more so today than 5 years ago, with ubiquitous broadband, the ease of access to talent pretty much anywhere. And we've built a team that's roughly 30 people strong out of 15 different nationalities. I myself traveled a lot prior to relocating to France, and I've basically invited the smartest people that I've met around the world, teams that I've had from Panama, from Argentina, from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from Great Britain, et cetera, and invited them to this location, and they took the opportunity with open hands, with open arms. In terms of Market share, we basically, or market size, what we discovered early on, and we're primarily relying on Google searches here, so it's by no means scientific data, but the number of searches for business relocation away from big cities to smaller ones is skyrocketing. COVID has been a major driver behind that, obviously, but the volume of searches was already very high prior to COVID. And we're seeing it on a daily basis. We're getting approached by 25 to 30 startups a day on LinkedIn alone, looking for what it is that we have to offer. And we're also attracting more and more investors, in particular angel investors, asking us how they can become involved with what we're doing here. And ultimately, the platform we're building with Uniqorn relies on a perfect balance between supply and demand, supply of capital and the demand coming from the startups. So in essence, we are no different than an Uber or an Airbnb. If you take the example of Airbnb, if you have no travelers, you have a problem. If you have no rooms, you have a problem. So you need to have a perfect balance between the two. And that's always a juggling act. It's not easy to get there.
That's almost the case for all businesses, right? It's you have to balance up sales with your capacity to fulfill those sales.
Absolutely. In our case, I think it's slightly more pronounced because most startups, early stage startups, they need funding. So unless you're able to provide that type of funding, you're not going to give them a reason that's compelling enough to make a move, for example, from New York City to Sala, France.
Mm. Well, one of the trends, at least in property anyway, in the UK, is that people have been moving away from bigger cities and into the country. So it makes sense that perhaps businesses are doing the same where you are.
Well, and you have very nice country in the UK as well, right? So I love London. It's one of my favorite cities in the world. But at the same time, as soon as you're 2 hours outside, you have absolutely beautiful country. So I can understand that. The other factors that you have, obviously, that are more economic factors are sky-high rents in London. I think we did a calculation recently. I think compared to Sala, it was 37-1 on average. So if you're a startup and you're raising any amount of money and you're looking at your use of proceeds, and a large part of your proceeds are going towards rent, which is a pure loss in the early stages, and you have the choice between paying £50,000 a month in rent versus £1,000 a month, the choice is pretty simple, or at least should be.
They call it the burn rate. Are you aware of that term?
Burn rate
goes up when you're paying 50,000 a month.
Well, rent. Right. I mean, the burn rate is basically everything that you will be paying as a startup business, assuming not a dime comes in revenue.
Mm. So, do you have some success stories as an investor?
So I have a number of them, but I would try to probably discuss one of them in particular because the very first company, which I can't name because of a silent period, that we incubated here at Uniqorn is in the augmented reality, virtual reality space. We started incubating them 10 months ago. And despite COVID, and clearly, obviously, technologies like augmented reality, virtual reality are booming during times like these, we are actually bringing it to market, to the public markets. The company will trade publicly in February next month in Canada and in Germany. So our very first company from incubation to public market listing within 10 months during COVID.
Wow. Well, you mentioned virtual reality, which is actually one of my questions. And what would you say? I mean, you don't have to be specific about that one in particular, but what would you say are some of the most interesting virtual reality projects at the moment?
I would certainly say as a result of COVID and as a result of people not having any other alternative but virtual or augmented reality, edtech, educational technologies, by and large. Probably closely followed by medtech, medical technologies and health technologies. Where I think we're going to see absolutely dramatic improvements, massive funding also as a result of COVID going into these spaces, including government funding. Obviously, if the kids can't go to school, we all have a problem. right? As parents, as educators, as politicians, as central governments. And to the same token, in the health space, we're seeing the health space being massively disrupted by all sorts of new technologies, platforms, apps, etc., that allow us to measure anything from blood sugar control to heart rates. Some of them are the fringe of health tech and fitness tech, because most fitness trackers also allow you to measure instantaneously, live, 24/7, certain health values. Those are definitely on the forefront of being massively disrupted by AR/VR. Last but not least, I'd say culture. Museums being closed, movie theaters being closed in most countries. You will see companies like Netflix coming out with a massively disruptive way of engaging in entertainment type of content. We're very much at the cusp of thinning the line and maybe even deleting the line between reality and fiction, which raises a number of ethical issues. The human brain not knowing not knowing the difference between reality and fiction. So for example, if someone comes in and holds a gun to Tom's head right now and has a helmet on and says he will blow your brain out, obviously your adrenaline is going to jump. All of a sudden he takes the helmet off. It's one of your best buddies. He says, look, there were no cartridges in my gun. This was a bad joke. I apologize. Your reaction wasn't any different as a human being, right? Everything was real for you. So, I mean, our brains are hardwired for anything, and the line between reality and fiction is quickly blurring. The reason why we can watch the same actor in a movie represent multiple characters across different movies and still believe in the storyline and not take a step back and say, in hindsight, this can't be right because Matt Damon was playing this guy last week or yesterday, now he's playing this guy. He's a priest today, he's a killer the next day, right? Our brains don't work like that. We get drawn in and we tend to forget, we tend to blur those lines. Now imagine one step forward, once Netflix delivers to you a fully immersive experience where you yourself can become a character in the plot. And that plot evolves as you go. There is no longer a script, a scenario being written out, but it will evolve depending on how you interact with certain characters and you become part of that plot. We're very, very close. What I'm talking about today already exists in the lab, has already been developed. It's just not mainstream yet. What I'm saying is that basically every industry known to mankind that is currently flat is about to be revolutionized by AR/VR. Some very early iterations that I personally worked with can give you one concrete example. We took a linear flat book with dinosaurs. Kids tend to be somewhat fascinated by dinosaurs, myself included when I was younger. And we showed it to a little girl called Amy. Amy went through the book. She was somewhat interested in the dinosaurs. Oh, this is a nice one, like the color, et cetera, et cetera. Now scratch the book, bring out the iPad, and now we give her an augmented reality version of the same book with the Triceratops jumping out of the screen and say, hi, Amy, I'm Triceratops. Let me tell you a little bit more about myself. Whoa. I mean, this little girl, given the two options, will never touch the flat book again, right? The engagement rate that you see with anything that is augmented versus anything that is flat, it's like going from, from a megaphone to digital audio to iTunes, right? It's even more so, right? The dramatic engagement rates, certainly also one of the ways, a lot of studies coming out about that, about helping resolve ADD in the school system, attention deficit disorder, where kids, because they are so accustomed to being engaged in different sorts of media. That's the reason why they're glued to a screen, right? This will take this one step further for good and bad. But as we all know, technology is a double-edged sword. It can kill the world and it can save it. It's all about us, how we use it. Heavy doses of AI that come into play, right? So if you're looking at these kind of technologies, they will all merge. So you have AI emerging with AR, VR, 5G, ubiquitous broadband, right? And becoming one fully immersive world versus being separate technologies.
That opens up a whole new topic. I thought it was a great answer, by the way. But going into AI, there's lots of differing opinions on how, let's say, potentially fatal it could be or positive it could be. What's your position on that?
So call me an internal optimist. Maybe I am. My vision of AI, I think there's one fundamental mistake we're making when the pessimists are discussing the potentially horrible ramifications of what they call runaway AI, which basically defines an artificial intelligence that becomes self-replicates, lives on its own, and basically either leaves us by the wayside, like the ants. It's no longer interested in us because it's too intelligent, or may even kill us. Terminator type of a future, right? I don't believe that for a second. And the reason why I don't believe it is because in my opinion, we will be experiencing is what some people, including Ray Kurzweil, call the singularity. The singularity being defined by the merger of humanity and technology. Human biology and technology will merge to a certain extent, are starting to merge. If you currently have a pacemaker, you basically have AI, you have technology inside of you. If you have a hip replacement, you have technology inside of you. Right? You have basically a version of Tesla inside of you somewhere. I forget about the brand, just to give the idea. And as a result of the two merging, there is no runaway AI. We will become one with technology, and that is what we call the singularity, which according to people like Ray Kurzweil will happen sometime between 2030 and 2035.
Interesting.
So don't be afraid of AI, because you will be AI. You will be AI, and some people will opt out. Clearly, a lot of you may have heard of Neuralink, Elon Musk's new project, which basically hooks up your brain, your frontal neocortex to the cloud. You will have the option of saying yes or no. Clearly, right? But the key question, which is an ethical one, a philosophical one, a political one, that we all will have to ask ourselves in the very near future is yes or no. Do I accept being enhanced, or do I refuse that enhancement, knowing that when you refuse, there will be a second class of citizens, call them the couch potatoes, who will be left behind, while on one side you will have superhumans. That will definitely happen. There is no question in my mind that that's what we'll have. And that is basically where I see, you're talking about a divide, right? Some people may think, well, that's only going to be available to the wealthy. Well, initially, as with any technology, that is the case. And as with any technology, including the cell phone that we already all have, the smartphone, when technology first comes to market, it is very expensive. It hardly ever works. And there's a lot of issues with it. So if you take, for example, the smartphone, the ancestor of the smartphone, we needed a briefcase to carry it around. It cost thousands of dollars, pounds, euros a month to carry around, and the costs dropped all the time. Then, as with any technology, it becomes rapidly democratized and demonetized. It becomes cheaper, more people can afford it, and it works better and better. And ultimately, people today on welfare carry a smartphone, can make their calls, and have access to a supercomputer in their hands that Bill Clinton didn't have when he was president of the United States. Right? That's what we tend to forget. To the same token, when economists calculate GDP, they make a fundamental error. GDP, in my opinion, is no longer an accurate way of measuring standard of living or how we're progressing on an economic scale. So when they're taking this device, no matter which brand, the smartphone, they're calculating the purchase value of that device, be it 100 pounds, 1,000 pounds, or anywhere in between. That's the only the only metric that's being incorporated in the GDP, completely disregarding the fact that the device itself, if you aggregate all the technology that went into it, is $1 million device, right? So they're not saying we're all carrying $1 million device on us. They're saying we're carrying a 500-pound device on us, which is a fundamental error. So in my opinion, GDP is no longer the way to calculate a standard of living, a standard of life.
Well, there's a comedic take on that point, which is what would you need to do if you were to take out all of the things which are on your phone now, but in prior times? So like the comedian goes around and says, all right, I've got to go and get my torch, and I've got to go and get my big map. And it's a whole point about how it's
my Encyclopedia Britannica.
Yeah.
All 34 volumes of them.
So as an investor, what is your opinion on shows like Dragon's Den or Shark Tank?
I know them both. I find them sometimes entertaining. I think they're somewhat dumbing down the process of what a startup goes through, slightly too mainstream, with a heavy dose of entertainment. So I don't want to say I'm opposed to them. I do find them entertaining. I think they do provide a certain value, even if it's an entertainment value. But I think that for those of you listeners who are looking to become a startup entrepreneur, this is probably not what you would be experiencing when you're actually pitching. I think some key differences that you would see is that first and foremost, you wouldn't just walk into a room with the same 4 or 5 characters on stage, all of which have ulterior motives, or they wouldn't be on that stage. They're also not representative of your typical investors, angel investors. They are public figures first and foremost, with heavy PR departments that make those types of investments out of ulterior motives as well, usually incremental PR. So what you basically would need to get ready for is something vastly different, where you would be trying to target your investor audience with surgical precision, look at the types of investments that they've made before, if that is actually in your industry. Then you would look at their appetite for risk, which will dictate whether they may be a seed, a pre-seed investor versus more down the line, a Series A, Series B, Series C, later on down the line. I would also say for those of you who are early stage startups, don't even bother with VCs, venture capital companies, because you will be rejected simply because, aside from a handful of exceptions, they're not interested in seed or pre-seed types of investments. So focus on angel investors, which in some parts of the world, including France, we call business angels, who are high net worth individuals that provide more than capital. In most cases, they have a network, a very strong network. Before asking him for money, show him a little bit of respect, which actually will help you to convert that potential investor into an actual investor. Don't just blatantly come up and say, I'm looking to raise money. Are you interested in investing? The answer will always be no, because if you're pitching cold and people don't know you, who will write you a check for £100,000? Nobody that I know will. Maybe you do.
I thought that was what you were going to say about the common mistakes. So if you're looking for an investor, I would expect it to be the case that people would just come right out and say, "Oh, do you want to invest in my business?" And that would be it.
Yeah. So I mean, first, if you're on LinkedIn and you're reaching out, because a lot of pitches that I get from both startups and in particular startups looking for investment on LinkedIn, 50% of them come out like that. I'm raising X amount. Are you interested? Ignore. Right. But if a startup comes to me and actually has read a little bit about my profile and is finding some interesting angles, or we could possibly work together, and shows a little bit of respect, I'm going to at least answer. Not a guarantee of investment, but step one, he's overcome step number one, which is to get my intention and actually to get me somewhat engaged to a certain level. Right. So be sensitive about everyone's unique persona. at least show them a little bit of a respect that you have read their LinkedIn profile, maybe looked at their website, maybe read their bio in full before coming back to them, and then find a creative angle on how you can wheel in that fish.
Good.
A hook point is what I would call it, right? We all have hook points. It's your job as a startup, if you're looking to raise money, is to find the right hook point, and that hook point is rarely the same for one person versus the next.
Well, you've certainly got an interesting profile. I have looked, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your story, if you wouldn't mind, because you said that in one of your profiles anyway, that you initially launched an auction site, was it?
Yeah, that was 25 years ago.
That's early,
actually,
isn't it?
launched in 1996, the first online art auction, which at that point was called theartauction.com. And interesting experience, because prior to that, I had a number of starving artists. I guess most artists are starving. They were painters, both watercolors and oil painters in particular, some photographers, and we were doing some very early digital marketing campaigns to promote their work. I've always been fascinated by painters and artists because I'm a very bad one. I could never relate to the fact that someone could actually produce a beautiful piece of art and that I couldn't. So I said, maybe there's another way I can help him. And sometimes we actually worked on trade, on barter. So I actually acquired a sizable collection of art as a result of the work that we did. So we were paid in kind. And then in March of 1996, we launched officially theartauction.com, first online art auction. First 3 months, a little bit of traffic, a few sales here and there, nothing to write home about. And then we were contacted by a large US magazine, news magazine, that came and did a feature on us. And a week later, we had 30,000 bidders on the auction site. And overnight, we were in the art shipment business, of which we had no clue about. So we were fulfilling art until 2, 3 a.m. Sometimes putting glass where glass was not supposed to be, forgetting to insure the art and shipping it around, and getting an awful lot of returns. And it was a nightmare until such a time where we had a knock on our door from a very large online auction site that basically offered to buy us out, and we took the offer. So that was an early experience as an exit. The first one in my career was 26 years old at the time. And then we've mostly been working on the entrepreneurial side on customer acquisition campaigns, digital marketing campaigns on behalf of financial services industries and travel companies, mostly. So in the late 90s, we had virtually every major travel brand as a client, figuring out ways on how to acquire new clients, new methodologies. And one thing leading to another, we had I had one large exit in 2001, where that company that was handling those campaigns was purchased by a publicly traded entity. That was right before, I think 3 months before the dot-com crash. So the timing was pretty good in that one. And then we went somewhat through a dark period, 2001, because everything crumbled. And I personally was in New York City, 9/11. I had 8 meetings planned that day. I finished my first 2, and then my third was supposed to be in the South Tower, which got hit by the second airplane. And my partner at that time was 45 minutes late. We were supposed to be in that building. So that was a very interesting story in a sad way. But I would say, when I say dark time, when that happened, it was an absolute shock. And being in New York during that time, I had been to New York many, many times before. I'd never seen anything like it. The mood in the city, where New York is a very vibrant city where people always smile, screaming around, et cetera, et cetera. Everything being shut down, including the delis, everything closing. It was spooky. And we had a very hard time. If I hadn't sold my company previously, I don't see how I would have been able to make ends meet, because businesses shut down. Everybody basically pulled in their spending, in particular digital ad spending at that time. post the dot-com crash. And I looked at that as a vaccine for later on in life. It was so painful that I told myself that, I'm going to make it through this no matter what. A lot of employees, all of which I kept, and I said, yes, we'll make it through, but we'll make sure that this can never happen to us again. So we took some very strong preventative measures, financial measures, basically, first time in my life at age 31, I realized there were market cycles. Before that crash, I thought, look, it can only go up from here, right? So for all of the entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs who have never actually experienced a market crash, the only thing I can say, it's not if, it's a matter of when it will happen. And you are either ready or you aren't ready. In 2001, I certainly was not ready. I expected this to continue on the uptrend like everybody else did, at least everybody my age. And I was in for a rude awakening. However, on the brighter side, the second downturn we had was in 2008. And we barely felt it as a result of taking those preventive measures of saying, look, we know it's going to happen again. We want to make sure that, yes, it will affect us like everybody else, but we will be ready to withstand what's happening until it is over. And that's exactly what happened. And today, during COVID, very much a similar thing, where we built, obviously, over the years, a small treasure chest to be able to withstand pretty much anything. And in the first 2 months during COVID, I didn't hear from anyone. Right, the phones would stop ringing, no more emails coming in, no more leads coming in from anywhere. Where we just, I told my team guys, just this is not my first rodeo. Just this is normal. This is human behavior. Just sit back and just wait it out. Okay. You see some younger guys getting nervous and girls getting nervous. My leads are not coming in. What am I going to do? Is my job safe? Yes, your job is safe. Just wait it out. And then I'd say about 2 months in, for no particular reason, one weekend, phones started ringing, emails started coming in on the same weekend. First thing I did is I went on Google News and see what the latest breaking news was. Couldn't find any in particular, because I thought that, maybe somebody announced the vaccine, or who knows what happened. But no, there was nothing there. And when I asked my clients, it's like, what made you wake up today? They said, well, I realized that, after a couple of months, we're still alive and probably going to be still alive sometime in the future. So it's time to get back to work. And those were mostly North American clients, American and Canadian, who tend to be more aggressive, I would say, than people in France, many of which are still obviously afraid about what may happen, especially with the second COVID variant coming from your shores, apparently. Who knows where it's originally coming from? That's all you see in the news today. But I told everybody, shut the news down and, wear your mask when you're in public. Use the hand sanitizer downstairs, and you can go back to work, right? So, like most, going back to startups and what makes a startup successful, if you look at the history of startups, it's always been during those downtimes, during tough times, that the smartest people have come forward with real solutions to real problems. Every time that times are plentiful, and I'm looking back right now at probably 1999, 2000, we've probably all heard the saying, party like it's 1999. I was in some of those parties, very, very lavish parties, and you were wondering what we were celebrating, right? .com companies with large investment money flowing in, the first thing they would do is throw a big party. It's nice, you can go have a party, but I didn't know what for. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing startups, some of which we're working with in particular as well, that instead of working on vanity projects, right, like building another social network for who knows what, right, are actually trying to solve real problems, such as onshoring of certain production projects, 3D printing, so we don't have to import products out of China, for example. You can print them right on, travel technologies, new travel technologies, including AR and VR enhanced travel products, because we're in no position to travel as freely as we did before, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On every single level, we're seeing a massive disruption by way of technology that I don't think we would have seen if COVID hadn't happened.
You mentioned in 2008 you put some preventative measures in. Can you tell me? Can you share in general what they are?
Yeah, actually, very simply, it was primarily on the accounting side, on the finance side. So, we typically set aside certain budgets for R&D, like most companies do, research and development, reinvestment into certain initiatives, including new initiatives, what we call moonshots, things that may never happen, but we're going to invest a little bit of money just trying it out, knowing that in all likelihood we will fail, but in the very unlikely event where we don't fail, that moonshot may actually happen. And we try to basically, we just reallocated some of those dollars into a piggy bank for a rainy day, for lack of a better term, right? So reined in a little bit on the aggressiveness, I'd say, and basically reallocated some of those funds instead of reinvesting them into projects, just setting them by the side, almost like an insurance program.
So you're essentially preparing for the next time it happens rather than not expecting it to.
Right, knowing that, again, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it will happen.
I think I might be wrong, but I think it's every 7 years on average that we see a recession. Yeah. Is that about right?
Yeah, so it used to be every 7 years. You're absolutely right. And more recently, what we're seeing is that the cycle is accelerating. And it's accelerating at such a pace that by the time we enter a recession today, we may already be out of it. Right? The cycles become shorter and shorter and shorter, right? So, which obviously brings up another topic that I'm being asked about very often, is, the topic of trend chasing, which is the next most important trend. What are you going after? And usually my answer to that question surprises a lot of people. It's actually an answer, I think, that originally was used by Jeff Bezos when he said that he's not so much focusing on what will change or may chase the trend. What he's doing, he's focusing on what he knows will not change, the mainstays. So what won't change is that we're probably going to wake up tomorrow and eat. We will need clothing. We will need transportation. We will need insurance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So focus on those things because they're a lot more predictable than the things that will change. Because if you took a synopsis of the top 100 economists on December 31st, 2020, and what they predicted for next year, the overwhelming majority of them will absolutely have failed. And they may be Nobel Prize winning economists. None of them have a crystal ball. But the ability to predict what will not change, you can do with relative accuracy, right? So, and then obviously, in order to take advantage of what does not change, Jeff Bezos is the perfect example, right? So people shop. Well, they want to shop more conveniently. They want to shop at a better rate. They want great customer service. If they're getting a product that they don't like, they can instantly return it instead of trying to bring it to some retailer that's going to give them, pardon my French, a bunch of crap, and they can't do it, right? So the choice becomes very, very simple. That creates trust and confidence. Why would anyone ever do business with anybody else if they try to return something to a physical department store and that clerk told them, no, we're day 31. You only have 30 days to return it. Go back home. Versus Amazon, sure, and we'll pay for the return shipping, right? And by the way, UPS will drop off a box with the shipping label on it. All you have to do is stick it in it and send it on its merry way, right? Clear choice to make. Here, in this scenario, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, has focused on what doesn't change. We still continue to shop. The only thing we do is we prefer to shop with someone whom we trust, versus someone we cannot trust.
It's a great answer. I just touched on one more thing regarding your exits from your first and second. So it's the auction company and also you got bought for your digital marketing agency. Is that right?
Yeah, that was a merger and acquisition with a public entity. So that was a part cash, part stock transaction.
Okay. And did you Because it sounds like the auction one, it was sort of like a welcome surprise. I guess my question is, did you go into it knowing what your exit strategy was, or did you?
I had no idea on the first
Okay.
one. No idea. Actually, be brutally honest, I had no idea that anyone would be interested in us at that time. That's how much hair we had on ourselves, right? I mean, we were just sweating it, trying to, do we have a specialist? We need to find someone who understands the art business, the shipping business, the insurance business, make sure this doesn't happen because we cannot continue like this, or we just have to shut everything down. So it was an absolute out of left field welcome relief to see that someone was interested in taking that monkey off our back.
So what about the second time?
Second time was a lot more structured.
Okay.
But very interesting story there as well, because we were growing so fast. When you grow fast, you usually have cash flow issues. So I remember this like it was yesterday. I was sitting on a Friday afternoon realizing that I wouldn't make payroll that weekend. And that obviously I would be the first one not getting paid. And my phone rang. And the person on the other line introduced himself, and he said, "Well, you don't know me. I know you. I followed what you've been doing, and we want to buy your company." And I'm like, "Well, my company's not for sale." And he told me, "Well, every company's for sale for the right price." And then he said, "I will send my driver up to you to North Hollywood," which is in California where I was. He was a little south of there. And I said, "Well, sir, I'm an adult. I have my own car. Don't send your driver up. Give me your address, and I'm coming down. But it may take a little while because Friday afternoon in Los Angeles, can take a while." He said, "Don't worry. I'll be here until 9 p.m." I went to see him. One thing led to another. Ultimately, that same day, I had never met the person in my life before. He pulled out a good faith check out of his drawer, put it on the table in front of me, because I still told him I wasn't for sale. And he goes, "Why don't you take this home, son?" I remember the term son. "And think it over the weekend. If you don't like it, keep the check." So I glanced on the check, and it was a almost seven-figure check. And I grabbed the check and said, "Thank you very much. We have a deal. I'll think it over the weekend." I rushed to the bank, and I made payroll that weekend. So that's how that happened. I would say that to answer your question more directly is that we, in those times, because things were going so fast and other companies were being acquired, we had a feeling that we were on the radar for a number of potential acquirers. We just didn't know when it would happen, right? And now with enough hindsight, because the dot-com crash happened shortly thereafter, the timing couldn't have been better, because if I had received that same phone call 4 months later, it would have been for 10 cents on the dollar.
Well, it sounds like you negotiated pretty well based on your position as well.
Yeah, and I had some co-negotiators who were more mature than I was, fortunately, in those times, and it did work out well. Yeah.
I know you probably don't need to, but it sounds like you could write a good book based on your business experience. Have you considered it?
I haven't considered it. I had at one point in time, I had a writer who told me the same thing, that he would want to put a pen to it. Probably something that one a little less busy, not preparing for obviously like a huge event, as you know, right, that we're preparing for right now in October here in Sala. At that point in time, maybe 5 years from now, 10 years from now, if people still read books by then, or if they can instantly download them to their frontal neocortex, maybe at that point.
So I always ask guests, what are your business goals for Uniqorn? Or what are your business goals in general?
Yeah, I think my business goals are absolutely, as you said, for Uniqorn. My sole purpose in my professional life at this stage is to become a very strong, very credible ally to the right type of startups. I want to empower them with the tools and services that they need to succeed, along with my team. I want to, at the same time, make out of our town here in Sarlat, in the south of France, a brand in the technology incubation space. We are, as it stands, the sole incubator accelerator. We welcome any potential competitors to move straight in with us. There's only healthy competition in this field. As long as you're helping other entrepreneurs make their dreams come true, by all means. And we also intend to be a magnet for foreign investors in particular to get a taste for the French tech ecosystem and for the benefit that it provides.
Well, your story is fascinating, and I'm sure you'll do great things with Uniqorn. Where is the best place for people to find you?
The easiest way is probably to find me personally on LinkedIn. Dom Einhorn, D-O-M as in Mary, Einhorn, E-I-N-H-O-R-N. Einhorn means unicorn in German. The website is unicorn with a Q, incubator.com, all in one string. My personal email is dom@unicornincubator.com. And then last but not least, for those of you who are interested in visiting us, the perfect time to do so would be 1, 2, 3 of October of 2021, when we're hosting the Startup Supercup, which is an event where startups meet capital, which will bring together roughly 1,000 investors, angel investors and funds, 100 media outlets, and 100 plus exhibiting startups.
Well, thank you again for coming on. I think you've added some great value, so thank you for that. And is anything else that you'd like to add?
Unless you have another question, Tom. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
My pleasure, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.